And welcome into your local election headquarters on KRK.com and Fox16.com. I'm Mitch McCoy. Glad to have you along with us today. You know, at this point, we've been talking with all of the candidates running for the Little Rock Board of Directors, and I don't want to waste any time. I want to get straight to our next candidate here. And if you've read his biography, if you've seen his picture, you know who I'm talking about. Tell me first your name and tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mitchell. My name is Greg Henderson, and I'm running for Little Rock City Director in position 10. I am a lifelong resident of Central Arkansas, and so Little Rock's very important to me, and that's a lot of why I want to run for City Director, just so that I can make sure that Little Rock is great for future generations as well. I own a food publication called Rock City Eats, where we work to promote local restaurants across the state and build culture through food. Through that, we also work to provide businesses consulting and marketing services, along with some other organizations across the state. With that, I've worked in some form of economic development and business development for the past 12 years. I'm also the president of the Downtown Neighborhood Association. We work on a number of advocacy issues with downtown residents and serve as the liaison between the residents and businesses with the state and city officials who represent us.
So I want to get right into these questions here. We have 10 questions. Everybody's being asked the same ones. Crime in Little Rock has been an issue for years. What is your opinion on the relationship between the Little Rock Police Department and the community? What ideas do you have to improve community policing, and how should the crime rate be addressed?
You know, certainly, I think that that's a key issue going on right now. And I think it's probably, a central topic that's happening. If you talk to the police chief, and he talks about the 21st century policing model, and what that is effectively is a better coordination between the police department and the residents of Little Rock. And so what that's going to mean is that, there is a closer, way of working. And that's very much in contrast to the way that we've handled policing in the past, which is focusing mostly on the enforcement end. That means once a crime's happened, that's when the police department's actually getting engaged with it. So it does very little to curb long-term crime rates if you're just focusing on the end result. And you can see that from the fact that Little Rock has a fairly steady percentage above state and national averages in crime rates. I think that we have to have city support for long-term crime reduction by investing in communities and community activities. That means better schools, because better schools prove to have lower crime rates with after-school opportunities to make sure the kids have something to do once they get out of school. We have to have better community programs for youth. We have to have a police force that is engaged in the community very frequently outside of just going out and having enforcement. That means, in a neighborhood association with downtown neighborhood, we really try to bring in the police and try to make them an integral part of how we handle, our month-to-month, day-to-day business. We also have to acknowledge that officers are often, right or wrong, the first responders in mental health and social work crises. So whenever we have a homeless person or somebody who's having, a mental health breakdown, a lot of times that's the police force are the ones that are called in first. And whether or not they should be the first ones, the reality is they are. So we have to make sure that we give them the tools to handle the situations through adequate training and continuing education. And I think finally, and this is the biggest thing that I've learned in talking to police officers, not just in Little Rock, but across the state and even across the country, is that we have to make sure that we have the personal mental health resources on the back end for the police officers to deal with the emotional toll that it takes them. A lot of officers that I've talked to, experience some levels of PTSD and some levels of just, mental anguish in having to deal with, very intense situations. We have to make sure that we take care of the officers so that they're mentally equipped to handle this.
Well, you talked a little bit about the police chief, and I want to talk about that for just a moment. There does seem to be some kind of an apparent discord inside the Little Rock Police Department. The police chief is facing multiple lawsuits from current and former city employees. The police chief, in his individual capacity, is suing Little Rock employees over civil rights violations. How do you plan on addressing some of these apparent issues inside the police department?
I think first and foremost, we need some serious mediation between the two sides. I've spoken to each side in various different capacities, and I think right now we just got to get them to come together and look for a resolution that's better for Little Rock. I think that probably an independent panel to will eventually be needed to address this. I don't think it could be the board because I think that the board's kind of too tied up in one side or the other. But I think what it really highlights is that there's a need for better transparency within the LRPD. This is not a new issue. This is not something that just happened with Chief Humphrey. This has been going on for some time, and I think it's finally spilling over to the surface where we're having to address issues because there's been a real divide in the police department. And I think that, bringing in an independent panel, looking at some kind of mediation, and, seeing how leaning on that independent panel to, help, create an outcome that, will help us move forward is what we have to do right now.
So the board's at-large position has always been a hot topic. If you've lived here for any kinds of years, you certainly know that. Do you believe the board should be restructured?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something where, I've been looking at for many years now of how, the board can be better equipped to serve the citizens of Little Rock and represent the citizens of Little Rock. Maybe it is at large, but I think what you see with at large, with all three at large positions, is that typically those at large directors take on a pet project or two. And outside of that, they really just deal with the community that's right around their home. That's not really working in and taking into account all of Little Rock, which is what the goal of an at-large is. The at-larges are meant to kind of serve as this overarching, voice of, balancing different wards in Little Rock. I think we absolutely need to look at that. I think we need to, continue to evaluate, different ways to do that. Also think there needs to be term limits, which, you've seen several board directors get in and they'll tell you, hey, if somebody wanted us out, then they would have left us out. Well, that's not always the case, especially in, bottom ballot elections where people aren't always quite informed and they just go to the name that, is the most familiar. And I think to that point, you also need runoffs. That's has to do with the structure of the city right now. There's a reason why we can't have runoffs in the race. I had ran back in 2018 and the city director that won only had a little over 30% of the vote. And a runoff would probably meant that she would no longer be city director. So I think that, to keep city directors accountable to the citizens, I think we need to look at term limits, runoffs, and yes, reevaluating the board structure in terms of the at-large positions.
Well, and speaking of the board and just city government in general, some board members have been vocal in recent months about an apparent disconnect between the mayor's office and some members of the board. How do you plan on working with the executive office but still hold executive leadership accountable?
I think first and foremost, there's always going to be room for some kind of healthy debate in City Hall and a difference of opinions that comes out of that. I think that, having a bunch of yes men or yes women or, yes members of the board are, never going to really move the city forward because we're not going to get in difference in ideas that make us reevaluate our decisions. So I think that some healthy debate is certainly critical, but I think we need to make sure that there's actually an open communication going on between the board members and the executive leaderships, just outside of the board meetings. I think a lot of times what happens is that there's an overall lack of communication going on and overall, feeling that one side doesn't know what the other side's doing. And I think that we have to work on, pushing for more and more communication. And, that way we can make the right decisions and have that healthy debate. And we got to put the egos to the side a lot on that. Sometimes there's some egos at play. And that's kind of what I really hope to do as a city director. I really want to increase those communications and, increase a healthy debate so that we can, make great decisions in the city.
Well, some would say that the city has taken a significant effort to revitalize neighborhoods. Others would respectfully disagree. How would you further those efforts?
I think that, just by saying that, some feel like we've done a good job and some feel like we haven't, I think that really addresses the fact that it's not been very equal across the city. And like I said earlier, I'm president of Downtown Neighborhood Association. We've had some great revitalization efforts going on between South Main and the Petaway neighborhood. Next door to us, Central High neighborhood starting to really, have some great signs of, restoration and, really revitalization. But I think that what we have to do is we have to look at, okay, we've got outdated zoning laws that kind of keep areas from growing. And so we need to look at that. A lot of those zoning laws haven't changed since the early 1900s. And we need to see how we can update those so that, it's encouraging growth and not holding back growth. And I think also we need to encourage rehab and restoration. And just, again, being a downtowner, I see a lot of vacant lots and I see a lot of houses that are boarded up. I see a lot of, properties that, really need some restoration. So I think that as a city, we need to do everything we can to promote those vacant lots being, or promote, building on vacant lots and restoring old houses and restoring old buildings to make sure that we don't have, those kind of problems. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later because that's a hot topic.
Yeah, and you really opened up because at this point, you're talking about vacant homes, vacant lots, things like that. Here's the fact: there's a ton south of 630,
Yes.
and that leads me into my next question here. People have voiced for years concerns about a racial divide in this city, specifically using Interstate 630 as a reference between poor neighborhoods, middle class neighborhoods, and upper class neighborhoods. What part will you have to unite this city?
I think that, it is, 630 has continued to be a divide. It has ever since they built it in. 630 plowed through one of the strongest Black business districts in the entire country at the time, and just demolished it. And that was kind of the start of this divide. Not that it didn't exist before, but it certainly made it worse than ever. I think that, as city director, you got to look at, yes, we got to bridge this divide. We've got to see how we can't, connect, parts of the city. I think that, certainly south of 630 needs some attention. I know I've heard the reference before, if you have a broken leg, you don't put bandages on both legs. You fix the part that's broken. And I certainly think that, we've got a long ways to go in south of 630. But also, I think that, what we also don't look at, what we don't talk a lot about is that we have to diversify all areas of the city. It's not about just north and south of 630. The reason those divides happen is because we continuously force Black businesses and minority businesses south of 630. We continuously force Black residents and minority residents south of 630. We don't give them opportunities to move into the traditionally white neighborhoods. I've heard a lot of stories from citizens and business owners that wanted to start a business in certain traditionally white areas of the city and were harassed by neighbors, had profane things said to them, talking about burning down their house or destroying their business. And whenever they went to the city board about it, the board refused to stand up, including the person I'm running against, refused to stand up and take their side. And I think as a city board, we have a unique opportunity to try to tear down some of these barriers that keep diversity from happening, that keep the separation in place. And too often we don't do that. And I think that that's something that has to change on the board. And that's why I'm excited about some of these positions starting to open up and look like they're going to turn.
Well, if elected, how would you improve the quality of life for every citizen in this city?
I think that the central core issue in Little Rock right now has to start with education. I think that without a strong Little Rock school district and a strong elected board, that we're not going to get there. The state takeover of the board. I was here. I lived through that. I had kids coming up in it, and I understand why they thought that it was necessary. But the reality is that the education system has gotten worse under the state takeover, and citizens feel less likely to trust and support the Little Rock School District because of that. And that ends up impacting, the economy. That ends up impacting our housing. That ends up impacting almost every aspect of life in Little Rock. And so when you look at quality of life, you got to fix that. You got to have people, whether you have kids or not, businesses don't want to locate here. People don't want to live here. If they're planning for kids, they don't want to bring their kid. They don't want to have kids here. If they already have kids, they want to live outside the city. And that hurts us all over. So I think you got to fix that. I think secondly, we got to look at support for small businesses, especially in the COVID pandemic. And I know we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I think that you have to support small businesses because they really are the lifeblood of a community. And if small locally owned businesses aren't doing well, neither is the city. And finally, I think you need to look at a quality of life focused planning. So whenever we're looking at city planning, a lot of times that's, where are we going to build neighborhoods? Where are we going to build roads at? We've got to also take into fact of, where are our parks going to be? How are we going to connect those parks to, mass transit? How are we going to make sure that, bike trails are treated every bit as important as roads are in the city? How are we going to make those, work together to make a unified city, regardless if you're walking, riding a bike, taking a bus, or driving in your car? We've got to look at that quality of life focused planning and make sure that the both are integrated and that we're taking both into account as we plan.
Well, I do want to talk about COVID-19, so let's get to that pandemic here.
Yes.
If elected, your term would consist of rebuilding the city's economy after the coronavirus. Many businesses, let me rephrase, maybe even during the coronavirus, right? Because this thing's not going away. Many businesses have been forced to close. What kind of experience do you have to ensure Little Rock not only bounces back, but it grows to a new height?
Yeah, whenever I was, debating, back in, even late last year about, whether or not I'm going to run, I don't think any of us expected it to get nearly as bad as it has, and I think that's across the nation. But for me, I feel like, it was a good time for me to end up running because I do spend a lot of time working with small businesses through Rock City Eats and, previous jobs with, Arkansas Economic Development Council and things like that. So I have an economic development background and I know how to work with small businesses to grow economy. Yet small businesses end up contributing more to the economy and revenue being spent around. They end up hiring more people. They end up having a broader impact on the quality of life and building culture through certain parts of the city. I think one of the things we got to do is we got to realize that we need to make sure that we're spending resources across the city, not just in certain parts. I think that when you're looking at how A&P dollars are spent, they're spent primarily in the River Market District and downtown, which is, great for great for those parts of the city, but it's also pulling money from other areas of the city that can be, better utilized. So I think that we need to see how we can't, spend some of the resources to promote, businesses in other areas. We need to see how we can't make, getting, business grants and loans for businesses that are struggling easier to access to the city. And I think we just need to be, as the city and as a city director, I think we need to be the biggest advocate for our small businesses, and we need to work on that part almost stronger than we do anything else right now, and make sure that that's equal across the whole city.
Right, and the board has such a huge responsibility for the budget. In recent years, the city announced a financial struggle which caused layoffs and park closures. If elected, how will you ensure the city avoids future layoffs and other closures?
The incumbent in my position, Joan Adcock, likes to talk a lot about, needs, wants, and things like that within the city budget, which, really, to me, speaks to the fact that she looks at the city budget as sort of, it is what it is. We don't spend enough time trying to grow the city budget. We need to look at ways where we can, grow resources that require, grow a city budget that require very little resources. And we can do that by, we talked earlier about filling in vacant lots. Vacant lots don't produce any property taxes. Property taxes are the biggest component of the city budget. If we can look at spending some resources to make sure that vacant lots are bought up and developed on, then that would end up increasing our city budget. But then we also have to look at other areas that, drain our city budget. If you look at 30 Crossing, which has been the I-30 expansion, which has been something that I've been, as Downtown Neighborhood Association president, very, big on, that project alone is going to end up costing us at least $30 million from our city budget, by way of, trying to repair some of the green space that we have, as well as being forced really to build new parks that, we weren't planning for. So if you're looking at parks, a lot of your parks are going to be, that are going through closures, they're going to be impacted probably 10, 15 years to come as we try to pay for some of this unexpected costs that really is something that the citizens of Little Rock by and large didn't want in the first place. We also got to, do a bunch of road repairs. They're going to tear up all the trolley tracks and things like that. So that's going to be, road repairs. We're going to have to reorganize streets. there's streets that aren't used to the same traffic flow right now. They're going to suddenly be in the middle of it. So as we're looking at, reworking streets, reworking infrastructure, that's going to take away from infrastructure in other areas that, are already suffering. And so I think as a city, we have to fight against that type of thing, and we have to stand up for ourselves, and we have to make sure that somebody else isn't taking our budget away from us. Um, and so I think that it's a combination of yes, we've got to try to grow revenue, and we have to find ways to grow revenue. But we also need to stop doing dumb things and supporting dumb things like 30 Crossing, which Director Adcock also supported, and it just ends up taking away from our budget and hurts us for generations to come.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Those are the 10 questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Mitchell, and thank you for KRK and Fox 16 for doing this.
Of course, we appreciate your time today. A reminder, Election Day is November 3rd. KRK4 and Fox 16 are your local election headquarters here leading up to the big day and, of course, on Election Day itself. For now, take care.